Okay, cause and effect. This is one of those episodes that does something very, very visually interesting, and I can definitely see why someone would want to try this in a TTRPG, but you would need a specific logic. Why? Because the core of the episode is a temporal causality loop, and you need to have an explanation for why there is a temporal causality loop. Now, going into the specific details of how there's a temporal causality loop is less important. You just need to have an explanation for why the loop exists. Because let's face it, we're dealing with sci-fi concepts that don't have any basis in reality, and thus actually explaining them fully is impossible because it's not real. Anyway, though, so what happens in this episode is the episode starts with the Enterprise getting blown up by colliding with something. And that explosion shot gets reused several times because of the fact that they didn't really have the budget to blow up the Enterprise 3 times. Was it 4? I don't remember the exact number. Anyway, though, what we eventually find out is that it collided with the USS Bozeman. Now, this is something that the writers threw in there without properly thinking through because of the fact that the USS Bozeman dates from the year 2268. That's kind of a problem since, or 78, whatever. It puts it between the motion picture and Star Trek 2. Which, yes, it is identifiable as this particular time period, but that also means that you more or less can't put anyone on board it that is from known to have been doing things in any of the TOS movies other than TMP. And for some strange reason, they decided they wanted to have Savick on board. Okay, having Kirstie Alley play someone, cool idea as a fun in-joke, because the fact that you have playing Morgan Bateson, you have Kelsey Grammer, who was a co-star of Kirstie Alley on Cheers. Well, because like when the Bozeman left the history books and entered the temporal vortex or whatever distortion, it was before Star Trek 2. So having someone who's in Star Trek 2 on board it would mean that you need to somehow have that person go back in time to do the things that they did previously, which is a continuity headache. Sure, you could theoretically work something out. It's just extra work. I would bother with it in a TTRPG. It just seems like a dumb idea. Anyway, honestly, it's one of those like things that having someone who is similar to Savick and looks like Savick enough that your crew mistakes her for Savick without actually being Savick, that's a workable idea. Anyway, so the USS Bozeman is a Soyuz class, which is a slightly more weaponized version of the Miranda class. Because, yeah, this is a weapon hard point. That's a weapon hard point. That's a weapon hard point. And this thing down here is also a weapon hard point. Now, at some point in DS9, they make some weird idea that the Defiant is the first thing that the Federation had created that was a purpose-built warship. Something built solely to be a combat vessel. Yeah, whatever. This thing has what, by my count, is, I think, 7 weapon hardpoints. And it's not a purpose-built combat vessel, supposedly. Yeah, whatever. Anyway, so the Soyuz was seemingly sent to explore the Typhon Expanse, which that's an interesting point, because as of 2368, which is when the Enterprise D went there, it hadn't been explored by any Starfleet vessel. And they run into the USS Bozeman there. Literally run into. Yeah. Oh, yeah. One explanation is that it was the fact that the two ships exploded in the while in the general vicinity of the temporal distortion that pushed the Bozeman forward through time. That explosion is what triggered the temporal causality loop. That was the logic that they had in this episode for why the temporal causality loop existed. Whatever. Anyway, also, that's the temporal causality loop. The only reason it's actually looping is because the ships keep exploding. Each time it explodes, it resets the causality loop, because it needs the explosion to keep happening for the temporal causality loop to keep happening. It stops looping if the ships don't explode. Anyway, though, so there's actually very little we know about the Typhon Expanse. It's been thrown into like 3 episodes, maybe 4. If you count the Typhon sector as being the same thing as the Typhon Expanse. And almost nothing has been said about it. Literally, almost nothing. So, having people explore the Typhon Expanse, sure, fun idea. The temporal distortion thing is something that, because of how little we know about the Typhon Expanse, we don't actually know why there's a temporal distortion there. That is something that had no explanation. That the Bozeman got shifted 90 years forward by a temporal distortion into a location where the Enterprise D would collide with it. And, yeah. Bizarre coincidence or something else? Yeah. That is just one of those insane things. Like, okay, now as a plot device, having the team of players go to explore the Typhon Expanse because, it's unexplored by the Federation, yada, yada, yada. Great hook. I don't like the temporal distortion nonsense as a way of forcing them to do a time loop. Because, one, when you have players doing this, it's entirely possible that the players would think of something that would actually work as a viable method of avoiding it. Because another thing that we note in the episode is that the people in the episode ran through a list of things that failed for no freaking reason whatsoever. Like, we can't change course because the computer is not responding. What? Why? That was not explained. Yeah, that's another thing about this is that it was forcing a specific solution narratively in a TV show. It's like the television equivalent of a logic puzzle where there is only one right solution, and you see the characters in the TV show trying to figure it out. That was my least favorite part of the episode. It was obvious that the writers had no idea how to resolve the problem and just made shit up. Not what I personally consider to be a great writing thing. Again, we don't really get any explanation for why so many of those options that the crew tried didn't work. Just that they attempted to do it and it didn't do anything. Like the throttle controls and stuff were just jammed. The computer stopped responding in the heat of the moment because it was the heat of the moment and something special and plot important was about to happen, and thus you can't change course. Yeah, players in a TTRPG would call bullshit on that. Heck, as a teenager watching the TV show, I called bullshit on that. For the TV show. It's just anyways. Yeah, so I wouldn't do that. Now, the whole idea with the USS Bozeman, that's a really fun trick because the fact that you're talking about a ship and crew from a different time period that is now intact in the wrong time period, and oh yeah, you can't just put them back because you just don't know how to do that. I think time travel 90 years into the past would be theoretically doable. It's just one of those things where it's like, realistically, it's hard and dangerous, and the Federation just doesn't try to do that as a regular basis, except when you have the Save the Whales episode where they totally do that because the plot demands it, and it's something that in theory later people like 100 years later would have the ability to do more regularly. Yeah, the TOS movies created several plot contrivances that don't make sense in the grand scheme of things, but whatever. Anyway, so for this one, having a TOS starship show up is actually something that you could use as a plot device for changing the cast of your TTRPG. Because you could, if one of your players has decided that they want to play a different character, you could just have the two crew swap ships. I mean, like for the case of the USS Bozeman, you could have someone get transferred to the Bozeman so that they could, get them up to speed on modern Starfleet and so on and so forth. And maybe a few people on the Bozeman are going to, well, I mean, okay, you could use the plot device that instead of simply adding a few people to the Bozeman's crew to get them up to speed, you're swapping out certain members of the Bozeman's crew. Now, as a plot device, sure, why not? To be honest, though, swapping out characters in a TTRPG campaign like that, there's a lot of plot devices you could do with it. The only reason you would want to use something like this is if you wanted to have someone playing a character who's from that time period and doing the fish out of water stuff with it. Which, sure, why not? I mean, that's something you can do if you really want to, I suppose. Okay, what else we have? This guy, he just shows up. We literally only see him on screen for like 5 minutes at the end of the episode. Is more of a cameo than a proper character. Okay, Soyuz class. Yeah, I mentioned already that the Soyuz class has certain interesting features. Like here is the Okuda technical drawing for it. Like you have the tuna cells here, which is, the standard for the Reliant class. Then you have the 4 weapon pods that are not part of the Reliant class tacked onto it. Yeah, these are just like struts welded onto the frame. And a little extension on the back of the secondary hull. Not a particularly elaborate series of modifications. Oh yeah, here's the 2 main phaser ports. It also had a torpedo launcher somewhere on it, and I don't remember exactly where the torpedo launcher is. I think like the underside of the yeah, I think this dent right here is the torpedo launcher. So remember, it actually has the bridge cake up here. Anyway, so yeah, that's about it for this episode. I mentioned the whole Savick thing was 2286. You can't have her get lost in time in 2278 and still do stuff in 2286. The whole temporal causality loop thing, having players do this, you would need to figure out a very clever logic for how to reset the temporal loop in a way that is breakable and not something players will figure out the first time they do it. Actually, that does bring up an interesting point. The cause and effect episode, due to the nature of the temporal causality loop, every time the loop reset, the deja vu effect became stronger. It didn't have events play out exactly the same way because of the fact that the deja vu effect was becoming stronger because, if I remember right, Dechion field. It was creating a Dechion field in the area, causing the deja vu effect. And every time this happened, it got stronger. And that's the reason why people had all of those premonitions and stuff, is that the Dechion field was affecting their perception of reality. They were seeing things that shouldn't be there. And at one point in time, Dr. Crusher actually made a recording of hearing dozens of voices in a format where you could actually listen to it in the ship's computer, which is like, oh, that's not actually her hearing something in her mind. That's her hearing something physically. And yeah, the Dechion field was so strong at that point that it was actually causing physical things like that, which is kind of strange, but it's what the plot was written. What are Dechions? Don't ask questions. We don't have answers. But yeah, that was another thing, is that the actual solution in the episode Cause and Effect was that the plot resolved itself because of the fact that the Dechion field was causing everyone to have premonitions and stuff. Now, that is apparently not true for the crew of the Bozeman. This was true of the crew of the Enterprise, not for the true for the crew of the Bozeman, which, if we go with the assumption that the Bozeman's destruction uh, was the result of it being pushed forward through time by a separate method, it's possible that the Bozeman's crew just simply didn't have time to experience any of this stuff, because the fact that the Bozeman was being pushed back in time, what is in reality 90 years, but from a subjective point of view, only a few minutes. So while the Decyan field was having an effect on them, they just, from their subjective point of view, didn't actually have enough time to notice. Because in the case of the Enterprise D, they figured out that their ship's internal chronometers were 17 days off after the whole thing was done. And this meant that the causality loop had been pushing them back in time more than 24 hours each time it triggered, which gave them more than enough time to wonder what the heck was going on. At least after they'd gotten to the point where the deja vu was really, really getting intense. It's also not entirely clear in the episode how many times the loop was triggered. See, because that's another interesting thing. The teaser is when we first see the Enterprise D get destroyed. There's this short scene where they're like, "Oh no, all hands, abandon ship, run!" And then the ship explodes. And of course, everyone dies. Now, that's actually something that's an idea that I just thought of that amused me, is that what if you had someone escape the ship uh, before it was destroyed? Would that person get pushed back in time with the temporal causality loop, or would they have been ejected from the temporal causality loop? That's something you might be able to play with. Anyway, though, yeah, it's like the end of Act One also is when we first see the Bozeman, because every time they did this in the show, they showed us things a little bit differently. They did reuse footage for several things, but they showed things differently each time. So like the in the teaser, we don't actually see what the Enterprise D collides with. In the Act One version, we see that it's another ship emerging from some sort of distortion in space. Crunch. Again, like I was saying before, having the other ship emerge from a time distortion where it's functionally on a ramming course with the Enterprise is just, huh? You need to come up with some logic behind why that's being triggered. And for this one, you could say that it's a time pocket or caused by a distortion in space, and that the reason why the Bozeman is visible is that it got kind of like suspended in time, and the Enterprise D entering the same area but broke the time bubble, suspending it in time. And also it means the Enterprise D is close enough to run into it. Eh. The time bubble could also be used as a way of explaining why the Enterprise D's computers weren't working right, but I don't really like that particular explanation. You could go with that if you wanted to, though. And let's see here. Again, at the end of Act 2, the whole thing explodes again. However, this time they actually have the crew aware of it and trying to change things. So, I don't. Yeah, 3 and 4. Neither one of them ends with the ship being destroyed. So we see the time loop get reset 3 times. Did it get reset more than that? Maybe. Yeah. So, like, I guess like you could say that like the first 3 or 4, the crew just doesn't notice anything, and then it's the later ones. But yeah, like I was saying before, we do know that the ship was getting pushed back in time more than 24 hours each time this happened. Oh, also, it talks about how power levels on the ship were doing weird things. Yeah, that actually, I suppose, is probably part of why the helm failed to respond. Is that the thrusters lost power, so you can't tell the thrusters to do something or what have you. Hmm. Again, players would say that's a plot contrivance that you're doing solely to railroad them. uh, and it felt like it was being railroaded watching the TV show. Anyways, I think that's about it for this. It's like the time loop thing, be very careful with that. Having characters from the past show up, eh, it's a thing you can do. And honestly, that's the majority of this episode. The core main plot point is just the time loop. That's it. See you guys later.